So today we're going to talk about real estate as it relates to selling your practice. This is 4 or 5 on the series that we've completed. And this is something that can become an afterthought until, it becomes a real problem. And so this is something you really have to be proactive on because the nature of real estate. I mean, you think about a landlord, they are people that are trying to maximize the value of a property, and that's their business. So, you can't get mad at them for trying to, increase rent or, redevelop their property. I mean, that's their asset, that's their livelihood, and that's the way their business is wired. So, inevitably, they're going to negotiate very hard to maximize their profit. They're going to be, very cautious when assigning the lease to new tenants. Um, and they come in all shapes and sizes, depending on your property, whether you're dealing with a big, REIT that is represented by a national property management company or a local family who just happens to own one building in the town that they may have passed down from generation to generation. So they all have different personalities and motivations in terms of how they handle these type of scenarios. Again, for those of you who are joining for the first time, my name is Dave Miller. I'm the managing partner of Rosen Dental Transitions. Mark here on the right um, the managing partner of Rosen and Associates, the accounting firm, and then Nancy in the middle runs Rosen Summit Dental Advisors, which is practice management consulting, training your staff, outsourced payment posting, insurance payment postings, basically anything non-clinical on the operations side of the business. And the one thing that I always say about real estate and just transactions in general is that disinterested third parties can be devastating to otherwise very healthy deals. The reality is this landlord has no incentive to allow this deal to go through, other than continuing to have a tenant in the space and continuing to have rental income, which you could argue is very high incentive. However, if they're in a market where they um, have an incredible amount of demand or the property is incredibly valuable and they have a line of people that would like to be a tenant in the space and potentially pay more rent than you, um, then their motivation for accommodating requests or working on the timeline you want, et cetera, can go down significantly. And some of it's just personality. Hate to say it, some landlords are jerks, just like some dental brokers are jerks. Some dentists, I'm sure, are not great people either. Um, you know, the averages are the averages. So every once in a while, you run across someone that just seems like a terrible person, and they just unfortunately are also your landlord. So um, let's get into how this can impact deals. We'll talk about, before the deal. Every renewal option you have in your lease is a chance to negotiate, and that's really your only chance to negotiate. So we're going to talk about that. Um, should you stay month to month or sign a long-term lease? This is a question we get a lot for practice owners that may be inside 1 to 2 years of retiring, and they've been in the same property for 50 years, between them and the previous owner. The third is, so the first two are really if you're renting your space from a landlord. The last two are if you own the space. So, do you want to be a landlord or should you sell the property as part of the transition? And what does that entail? And then the last is if you decide to sell, what does that process look like? Should you get a building appraisal? Things of that nature. So, jumping right in. So, lease renewals. If you lease your space from a landlord, you don't own the property, um, timing is everything. So most people will sign, most commercial leases do not like to do a lease term shorter than 5 years. And then you could have multiple renewal options after that. They could be 3 years, 5 years. You could have initial term of 10 years with, 3 5-year renewal options. Options protect the tenant. They give you security in the space that even if they sell the property to someone else, your lease transfers to the owner and you can be in that space for 20 or 25 years, which is critical for a dentist because it costs so much to build out the space. There's so much goodwill tied to the location that if um, you're kicked out of your space late in your career, you could spend 750,000 to $1 million to move your office, depending on the size and where you are and the cost of construction. So first thing you need to understand is what are the renewal dates for your lease? If you signed a 5-year lease in 2023, it's going to renew in 2028. What date is that? And then you will have a notice provision in your lease as well that'll say, tenant should provide notice 12 months prior to the renewal period. Sometimes they say something like if notice is not provided, then the landlord, the lease will automatically renew. Um, and so that date is important for a couple reasons. One, if you want to relocate or negotiate, you have to provide some notice, or you want to get out of your lease, you have to provide notice at the appropriate time. That the reason the landlord has that in there is so they can hire a broker and put it on the market and find a tenant to take over the space after you're done. The second piece is when you are negotiating your lease, your only leverage as the tenant is the threat to leave. And the landlord knows that a dental office is not cheap to build out. They may not know how expensive it is, but they know it's not cheap. Um, they probably think it costs the same as any other, you know, primary care physician. Like I said, they don't realize the plumbing, the electrical, the flooring. It's dramatically more expensive for you to build out than a, dermatologist or somebody who's just doing a medical practice. So if you plan to negotiate, you have to approach the landlord at least 1 year prior to your renewal, if not 18 months. Because if you are going to essentially threaten to relocate if they don't play ball with you, if you're 1 month from your lease renewal, they know you don't have time to do that. So they can call your bluff and basically refuse to negotiate because they know the risk of you leaving is not real. So that's the other reason why knowing your renewal dates and approaching your landlord at the appropriate time is critical. Also, in this process, we cannot recommend hiring a healthcare specific real estate company to represent you. And it may sound silly to hire a real estate broker to represent you in a renewal, but for example, Carr Healthcare real estate firm that specializes in only tenant representation, they are paid by the landlord for negotiating. So it doesn't cost you anything. The philosophy is, as your broker, if you leave the space, the landlord is going to have to, demolish and pull all the dental fixtures out of there. They're going to have to put new paint. They may have to do some new fit up. Um, they're going to have to hire their own broker. The space is going to sit empty, which means they're going to carry some operating costs. And then they're going to have to pay broker commissions. So relocating for you is costly. It's equally costly for the landlord. It's not like it's just a retail store where all they have to do is put new lights and paint the walls. Like you've done significant renovations and construction, they're going to have to probably gut the space or really, strip it down to get it ready for the next tenant. So, and it's not easy for them to find another dentist to take your space because they're going to ask, well, why did the last dentist leave? And if it's like, well, they went down the street to open a bigger office or the landlord's a jerk, those are really only the two reasons why dentists leave their location. It's either because the landlord's untenable and the building's crappy, or they are growing and they have outgrown the space and they need more capacity. So it's challenging for a landlord to just dump a new dentist in an empty space. So timing's critical. I do know Carr Healthcare Realty does free lease evaluations. So you can just send them your lease. They'll look at your renewal dates, and then they'll also look at the second piece, which is what is your rent versus market rent? Every lease, for the most part, has escalators, and it could be tied to a couple things. Every year, your rent's going to go up. It could be based on the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. It could be a flat increase of 2 to 3% every year. It could be, no increase, but at the end of 5 years, it bumps up 10%. It could be, you have a base rent, and as operating expenses go up, they go back and they reconcile and they adjust based on, what expenses went up, property taxes go up, things like that. So your rent is going up every year. And the question is whether the escalators that are in your lease have outpaced the commercial real estate market in your area. In some areas, the lease protects you. Rents could be $30 a square foot and you're at $20 a square foot because you signed a 10-year lease and it has, 2% escalators and the market around you has gone up at 15, 20%. In the Boston metro market, that can certainly happen. Um, and I think, if you're in a retail space versus an office space, those markets have obviously been impacted differently, especially after COVID. Office buildings, I'm sure if you're in one, you may have some vacancies, you may have tenants not renewing because they're remote with their staff. So you need to understand the surrounding market and where your rent sits. If you're at 18 bucks a square foot and market rent is $22 a square foot, might not be the best time to try and negotiate. But if you're $18 a square foot and market rent around you is $13 a square foot, then that could be a great opportunity for you to potentially save money on your lease renewal by negotiating with the landlord. Well, we always say the other reason to hire a broker is leverage is best when it's real. And so, what a good broker can do for you is find spaces in the area and get proposals from landlords of what it would cost to relocate, um, and show you the math. Say, for example, we've had doctors before that were paying $28 a square foot for rent, and there's spaces in their market that are $18 a square foot. So that's a significant decrease in the cost. On top of that, the new landlord will give them free rent. The new landlord will give them, sorry, just admitting a couple more people here. Um, the new landlord will give them tenant improvement allowance. They'll give them money to build out the space. And so there's financial incentives for you to relocate. And you can then weigh that against whether your landlord is willing to negotiate. And it gives the broker leverage to say, listen, we have these offers. You know, our client can get a brand new space built out exactly the way they want, and add additional operatories. And from an economics perspective, it's very similar to just renewing and staying in the same space. So um, even if you don't get your rent reduced, sometimes you can get 1 or 2 months of free rent, or maybe you can get the landlord to give you a fresh coat of paint, new flooring, and light fixtures. Again, all under the argument that if you've been in the space for 15 years, most other spaces have turned over 3 or 4 times, and every time that happens, the landlord has to put a fresh coat of paint, put new lights up, fix the carpet, whatever they may have to do. And so by not having to incur those costs because you've been a long-term tenant, you may be entitled to some tenant improvement allowance or renovations in the space at the landlord's expense. Again, if you don't have any negotiation leverage, it's hard to ask for that stuff. We think hiring a broker gives you real leverage and will help you understand the market so you feel confident negotiating. So that's more about the economics of the lease and how you can save money. And one thing that's important is practice value. The value of your dental office is based on profit. So if your rent goes from $80,000 a year down to 60 because you negotiated, that has increased your profit by $20,000 a year, which would likely increase the sale price of your practice from anywhere from 70 to $100,000 a year. Or sorry, from 70 to $100,000 on top of your current price. So that's why it's important to make sure you're within market rent, you take advantage of your opportunities to negotiate, and you understand the market around you and what your renewal options are and when they're left. The third option is the legal language when you're renewing. All assignability clause is going to be favored for the landlord. Typically, it says landlord has sole discretion to decide whether to assign the lease if they have a tenant who's of equal or greater value financially than you are. Well, the reality is, depending on your practice, you've been in business 30 years, an established practice owner, and you may sell your office to an associate who's never owned a practice and does not have near the balance sheet that you do. So trying to negotiate that assignability clause to be more reasonable or to create some language that if the buyer meets a certain profile or they can get financing for the purchase, the landlord will assign it. Not all landlords will go for it, but trying to understand that assignability language. And if there's any opportunity to improve that so it's a little bit more protective or beneficial for you as the tenant, especially when you go to sell. Because what can happen is if you have a landlord who's really tough, they can say, well, this buyer has never owned a business before. They only have $60,000 in the bank. Um, and, I don't feel comfortable signing the lease and releasing you 100%. You want to get released from the lease. So what they may ask is for you to stay on for the remainder of the term or for a couple years, or they could ask for the buyer to put down a larger deposit. Things like that can impact the transition. Because if a buyer has to put $40,000 down on a lease deposit, or you have to stay on the lease, there's some additional risk for both sides depending on what the landlord requests. So again, when you have your lease reviewed, look at the assignability clause, see if there's an opportunity to negotiate that on your next renewal. The other thing, which is kind of unrelated to that, is just relocation clauses. Some landlords put that they can relocate people in a center, and Apple comes knocking on the landlord's door and says, hey, we want 20,000 square feet to build a big Apple store, and they're going to pay an insane amount of rent. The landlord may say, okay, well, I'm going to move you down to the end of the shopping plaza. And again, very expensive. The landlord probably doesn't understand that. But so you just want to make sure some of these clauses are looked at by someone who really understands dental real estate. The next question is lease term. So if you're month to month now, should you sign a long-term lease before you sell? The answer is it depends. You want to talk to a practice broker and understand the likelihood of selling your practice, because if you are, you have a 5-chair practice that does $1.3 million and you're inside the 495 loop, or you're within an hour of Boston or a major kind of metropolitan area, and you have a healthy practice, you're going to have no problem selling that office. And if you can, you know, lower your rental rate or get the landlord to pay for renovations and give your practice a facelift at the landlord's expense by signing a long-term 10-year lease or a 5-year lease with options to renew, then that could make a lot of sense, assuming you can get the assignability clause to a point that you're comfortable. Because obviously, the plus side is you could get lower rent, increases the profit. You could get your space renovated potentially. That also increases the value in the eyes of the buyer because they don't have to give it a facelift. And you have long-term security of an assignment. So when a deal comes in, if you have a long-term lease, the buyer is going to just request an assignment of the lease. And all that means is they're not going to negotiate anything with the landlord. They're going to take the lease exactly as it's written to you, and then they are going to, swap your name for theirs, and they're going to be on the hook for your lease. So there's no negotiations and a chance of the landlord increasing the rent or disrupting the deal. Um, it it's just a kind of a clean transfer. So it eliminates a variable from the transaction. The only potential downside is if the assignability language isn't great, or the landlord is someone who's notorious for not letting people released. Um, the you have a 10-year lease and there's 5 years left. The landlord could say, well, I want you to stay on for 2 years, or I want you to stay on until this term's up, which is 5 years, which means ultimately you would still be liable for that lease if the buyer were to go under. Chances of that happening are slim, but it's still a lease. It's still a liability you don't really want. So that's where you want to talk to a broker, understand the likelihood that your practice will sell. And then the second is talk to an attorney to understand your assignability clause. And maybe there's a way to, if you're going to sign a long-term lease, get that language set in a way that's more favorable. Like one creative way we have seen that not all landlords go for is all the buyers can get 100% financing to buy these practices, but the landlords don't understand how easy that is. So we've had people put in that if the buyer of the business can obtain financing from a national lender like TD Bank or Bank of America or whoever, then that would qualify them for assignment. And the argument is a bank makes a living assessing risk. And so if they are willing to give this person $1 million to buy this business, you should feel comfortable assigning the lease. Again, not everyone goes for that, but some landlords are like, all right, well, that kind of makes sense. Like, and they may not believe that that would be possible. So again, keeping that in perspective. If you're going to relocate, we don't recommend relocating if you plan to retire in less than 5 years. It's incredibly difficult to generate the ROI required of the cost of a construction project unless you are going to see explosive growth. So if you're on the fence about relocating and you're planning on retiring soon, we'd recommend not doing that. Um, Benefits of the lease assignment versus negotiating. So if you're month to month, the risk is when a new tenant comes in, the landlord could say, hey, Dr. Smith has been my tenant for 30 years. I didn't really raise his rent because we got along great and he was a great tenant. You're a new person, so I'm going to bring your rent up to market rent. So instead of the rent being 4,000 a month, it's going to be 5,000 a month, which may not seem like much, but now the buyer can say, listen, this is a material change to the profit of the practice. I want my price reduced slightly because the practice is not as valuable as it was. And that seems silly. And, there's always a negotiation, you push back, but that's an example of something that could, um, you know, impact or trigger a deal. Where with the assignment, if there's existing lease years left, you can just go to the landlord and say, hey, I've sold my practice, I'm retiring. I have a buyer who's, credit worthy. They have financing from Bank of America to purchase it. They're a great fit. I want you to assign the lease to them and release me from it. And so there's no negotiation at all in that perspective. All buyers that obtain financing, the banks are going to require a minimum of 5 years on their lease to get their loan. Some banks require a lease that is as long as the loan they take. So, for example, if they take a 10-year loan to buy your practice, they would need a lease that could have 5 years left on the lease plus one 5-year option to renew. That totals 10 years of protection that allows them to get the financing. So, again, all goes back to have some people look at this and think about it as it relates to your practice. If you're in a very small office that like 2 chairs or 3 chairs, it might be better set up to be a merger into a nearby practice instead of someone buying it, then you probably want to stay month to month. If you are a specialist in a rural area, it can be very challenging to find specialists. So if it's something where you may not be able to sell at all, again, you probably want to stay month to month or year to year in short-term leases. Um, so it's balancing the risk of not having security versus the risk of obligations past a specific term. If you're really not sure if you can sell, the ideal scenario is to have a 1-year lease with multiple 1-year options to renew. Because say you can get a 1-year lease with 7 1-year options to renew, that gives you 8 years of security. And every year you could say, all right, well, I can't find a buyer, decide I'm going to retire. You give the landlord notice and you can be done in 6 months or a year. So again, super important to take all of the factors into perspective when considering what to do with your lease term and the obligations you have at the end of your career. Generally speaking, as far as concessions go, the longer lease you're willing to sign, the more landlord's willing to give you. So, should you be a landlord or sell your property? Some of this depends on lifestyle. If you're going to relocate to Florida after you sell from New England, you may not want to deal with a property back in the Northeast. What I will say is a commercial lease is very different than residential. I hear some sellers say, well, I don't want to be a landlord. I don't want to deal with the headaches. A residential lease has headaches. The tenant could call you because there's a clogged toilet, they got locked out and lost their keys. It's just, there can be a lot of maintenance things. In commercial real estate, depending on your property, typically you're going to set up what's called a triple net lease, or you'll see this NNN lease term. What this means is that you set a base rent that could be $4,000 a month, and then the tenant is responsible for all usual maintenance. So these property taxes, building insurance, all of the operating expenses are passed through to the tenant. So that will give you the ability to basically net profit and you don't have to maintain the real estate. We even recommend that, like, the person would contract their own snowplow company. That way, if the snowplow company doesn't show up, they have a direct contract with them. They're not calling you to see why they didn't come in. So, from a maintenance and oversight perspective, commercial real estate is much easier to manage than residential. So that's one piece. The second is just financially, would you like to have that monthly income to help balance your retirement portfolio? Everybody's in a different situation. So monthly income versus a lump sum. it depends on your plans. Again, if you want to buy a condo in Florida, it may be better to, sell the property and then flip the proceeds into, another vacation home or whatever it may be. So that's a big piece, is considering the financials. The other thing is the the more flexible you are, the larger buyer pool you have. Because you could have a buyer who you think is a great fit who wants to buy the practice. And if your real estate is $800,000, the down payment's typically 15 to 20% on commercial real estate. That's 160,000. They may have the cash to qualify for the loan to buy the practice, but they might not have the cash to put 160,000 down and borrow that additional $640,000. So that's where, if you're flexible, you could say, all right, buy the practice. I'll give you a lease for a year or two. And then as soon as you get the business kind of established under your name, you can go back to the bank, and the bank will likely give you 100% financing or give you the loan at that point because the risk of the transition is gone. Again, depending on your area, you may want to be flexible to maximize your buyer pool. If you're in an area with incredible demand, you can kind of dictate and say, all right, yeah, I want to sell the real estate with it at the same time, and all offers have to include that, and that'll help trim your buyer list down a little bit. The last piece is just the sales process and the appraisal. Commercial appraisals can be expensive, anywhere from $1,200 to $3,000, depending on the size of your property and the market. So what we always say is you can get a broker's opinion of value, maybe from a local commercial real estate broker. We have a company we use to help do it for our clients, to give you an idea of the sale price, because the buyer's bank is going to require them to order an appraisal through the bank. So the way the process would work is you guys would, the buyer and the seller would agree on the purchase price of the practice and the purchase price of the real estate. The buyer is then going to take those two signed offer letters and go to the bank and get an approval. And the bank is going to come back and say, all right, here are your terms for the purchase of the building, for the purchase of the purchase of the practice, and the purchase of the real estate. Once you sign with us, we're going to order an appraisal through the bank. The bank has to order the appraisal. That's the way it is with regulations. So if you spent $3,000 on an appraisal 30 days ago and you say, all right, I'll just give it to the bank, most banks will not accept it. So the buyer will pay for that expense, and that appraisal can take 3 to 4 weeks to be done. And that has to come in at the sale price. The bank's going to be limited to 100% of the appraised value. And so if you're asking 800 and it appraises for 700, the bank's only going to finance 80% of 700. And so that usually means you're going to have to end up renegotiating the real estate and figuring that out. Um, and then closing usually takes 2 weeks after that. One question, I know we're at 1 o'clock. One question that popped up is, any thoughts on how to structure the lease so it's attractive to DSOs? DSOs do not want to buy the real estate. Some have REITs that they partner with that will buy the real estate if you really want to sell. DSOs want, typically, if you have a large office, they're going to want long-term security. So if you are a smaller office that they envision merging into, sometimes they have a flagship location in a market that has 12 chairs, and they buy offices and then they slowly merge them into this large location, then they would want something with flexibility, maybe 3 to 5 year options, but multiple options to renew. Ideally, to provide any buyer, it's like, I would say, like 5 year terms with 3 5-year options. That gives the buyer 20 years of security. And then if they want to reassess whether they want to relocate or move, every 5 years they would have that option. So I think that's the biggest piece. They're not going to want like a month-to-month lease or year-to-year. They're going to want something that has long-term options to renew. Recommend for real estate appraisals, it's really market specific. What I usually recommend is looking at commercial properties in the area and calling them and seeing if you can get a broker's opinion of value. They, they can usually tell you the rental rates in the market, and what you may want to charge a tenant. The other thing is we have a company that we can order reports. They're $500. And we're happy to do that for people that, if, even if you're not getting a practice appraisal through us, we can help you connect with that and show you an example what that looks like. The third option is to call a company like Carr Healthcare Realty. They do tenant representation. but they might be able to give you like an opinion of value on rental real estates or rental rates in the market. So those are the three routes. Uh, no, I think any advantage to a local real estate firm versus a large nationwide like Carr, I think the advantage is you want to find a real estate agent who only does tenant rep, in my opinion, because most brokers and real estate agents spend 80% of their time chasing landlords and wanting to work with them and chasing listings. And so their willingness to negotiate to get a deal done may be a little bit different because the person they are negotiating against, they may want their business as a broker. Where if you have someone who only does tenant rep, there's never a conflict of interest and it's not like they have to do showings for other properties. All they're focused on is finding real estate in the area. Where a local broker may be beneficial is if there's off-market properties or things like that, they may have the inside track, but that's pretty rare. Usually we find it's like we recommend finding someone who specializes in tenant rep, whether that's local or national. So um, I know we're a couple minutes over. Obviously, thank you all for joining us. As always, if you missed or came in late, all of these webinars we've done are recorded and shown on our website. You can download them for free. We have a resources page that has podcast, articles, webinars, all sorts of stuff we've done. So all free to anyone who joins. So again, enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining. Have a great day.